In 1932, a woman in rural Ohio fed her husband and 3 children dinner every night for 11 cents. 11 cents. She used a soup pot, a wood stove, and whatever was left at the bottom of the root cellar. Her doctor years later told her she had the bone density of a woman 20 years younger. That soup is number 6 on this list. Number 14 was so common during the Depression that soup kitchens stopped writing the recipe down. Everyone already knew it. Number 3 was invented by a widow in Mississippi who had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. She made it from things most people threw away, and it fed her family for a week. These 20 soups were not failures. They were not desperation dressed up as dinner. They were the most honest food ever made in American kitchens, built from nothing, cooked with everything, and served to people who had already lost almost everything else. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 forgotten poor man soups from the Great Depression that cost less than $1 and fed a nation that had nothing left to spend. Number 20, water soup. This is where we start because this is where some families had to start. A pot of water, a few wild onions pulled from the yard, a heel of stale bread dropped in to thicken the broth, salt if you had it. That was water soup. And in the worst years of 1931 and 1932, it was the difference between eating and not eating for thousands of families across the rural South and Midwest. There was no recipe card. There was no name written down in any cookbook. Mothers made it quietly, served it without explanation, and watched their children eat it without asking questions. The bread dissolved into the hot water, making the broth cloudy and slightly thick. The onions gave it something, a ghost of flavor that convinced a hungry stomach it had received a real meal. A handful of wild onions cost nothing. A heel of bread was already going stale. The water was free. And somehow, from those 3 things, a mother produced supper. Food historians rarely discuss water soup because it embarrasses the narrative of American abundance. But the families who ate it remember, and they remember the woman who made it, standing at the stove, keeping her face still, pretending this was simply dinner. Number 19, cornmeal porridge. Soup. In Appalachian Kentucky and the hill counties of Tennessee, cornmeal was not just food, it was currency, it was insurance. It was the thing you kept in the back of the pantry for when everything else was gone. A handful of cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling salted water until it thickened into a pale yellow broth. Not quite mush, not quite soup, but something exactly between the two. Mothers added a spoonful of bacon grease when they had it. They added a pinch of dried pepper when they had that. They added nothing when they had nothing, and it still worked. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal cost 12 cents in 1933. It produced enough soup to feed a family of 5 for 3 days straight. The women who made this did not call it a recipe. They called it making do, which was the highest form of cooking the Depression ever produced. Number 18, turnip green soup. Here is what nobody tells you about turnip greens. The green itself costs almost nothing, but the liquid left behind after cooking, dark, mineral-rich, slightly bitter, is more nutritious than the green it came from. Depression-era mothers in Georgia and Alabama did not throw that liquid away. They added water to stretch it, dropped in a piece of fatback or salt pork if they had one, and let it simmer until the whole pot tasted of smoked pork and earth and iron. A raw onion went in. A handful of dried field peas if the pantry allowed. The result was something so deeply flavored it was hard to believe the entire pot cost less than 15 cents. Nutritionists now know that turnip greens contain more calcium preserving than milk. The women who fed their children this soup in 1934 did not know that. They just knew their children were not getting sick the way the neighbors' children were. They were right about the reason without ever knowing the science. Number 17, potato peel soup. When the potatoes were peeled, most kitchens threw away the skin. Depression households did not. The peels, thick ones, cut deliberately deep to leave some potato attached, went into a pot with water, a halved onion, salt, and whatever herb was growing in the yard. Simmered for 40 minutes, strained and served as a thin but surprisingly savory broth. The starch from the potato skin clouded the water and thickened it slightly. The onion sweetened it. And the broth that came out tasted nothing like what it was made from. Families who kept kitchen gardens in rural Pennsylvania and Ohio made this soup specifically from the peels set aside during regular cooking. Nothing that entered the kitchen left without giving something back. That was not philosophy. That was economics. That was survival disguised as thrift. Number 16, bean water soup. After a pot of dried beans had been cooked and the beans themselves had been eaten, for dinner, for lunch, for the next 2 days, the water they cooked in was not poured down the drain. That liquid, creamy white and thick with dissolved starch and protein, went back on the stove. Salt went in. A piece of cornbread crumbled in to thicken it further. Sometimes a raw onion was sliced thin and dropped in to soften. The result was bean water soup, a broth built from the memory of a meal that had already ended, stretched into one more bowl for one more night. It tasted of beans without containing them. It was filling in the way only starch can be. and it cost precisely nothing because it was built from what would otherwise have been waste. A family in rural Missouri reported eating bean water soup 3 nights in a row after a difficult week in 1935. The mother kept a journal. She wrote, "Made something from nothing again. Children slept full." That sentence is the whole story of Depression cooking. Number 15, oxtail broth. The butcher sold oxtail for almost nothing in the 1930s because nobody with money wanted it. It was too bony, too strange, too much work for too little meat. Depression mothers knew better. 1 oxtail, simmered for 4 hours in a pot of water with a carrot, an onion, and a bay leaf, produced a broth so rich and gelatinous it solidified in the pot overnight. Reheated the next morning, it became liquid again, golden, deeply savory, coating the mouth the way expensive restaurant soups do today. The tiny scraps of meat that fell from the bone went into the bowl. Nothing else was needed. An oxtail cost about 8 cents at most butcher counters in 1932. The vegetables added another 3 cents. For 11 cents, a family had 2 meals of soup so nourishing that the children who ate it grew up with strong bones and steady constitutions. Modern restaurants now serve oxtail broth for $18 a cup and call it heritage cooking. The heritage belongs to the women who invented it out of necessity 60 years before any chef discovered it. Here is something that needs to be said plainly. The soups on this list were not made by people who lacked intelligence or skill. They were made by people who lacked money, which is a completely different thing. The women who built meals from potato peels and bean water and oxtail bones understood their ingredients at a molecular level, even if they never used that word. They knew what thickened a broth. They knew what added depth. They knew which scraps contained the most flavor and which could be coaxed into giving more than they seemed to hold. Food companies spent the next 30 years convincing those same women to buy canned soup instead. They told them it was modern. They told them it was easier. They told them it was better. It was not better. It was just more profitable for the people selling it. Number 14. Salt pork and cabbage soup. 1 head of cabbage, 1 small piece of salt pork, water. That was the entire shopping list for the soup that fed more Depression-era families than almost anything else on this list. You quartered the cabbage, dropped it in a pot with the salt pork and enough water to cover everything, and let it simmer for an hour until the cabbage turned silky and sweet, and the pork had perfumed every drop of the broth with salt and smoke. The broth turned slightly golden. The cabbage collapsed into tender ribbons that held the flavor of the pork without a single bite of actual meat being required. A head of cabbage cost 3 cents in 1933. A quarter pound of salt pork was 4 cents. For 7 cents, a pot of soup appeared on the table that tasted like something a careful, skilled cook had labored over. The careful, skilled cook had. She just had nothing to work with except a knife and a stove, and the knowledge passed from her mother to her. Number 13. Dried mushroom soup. In the forests of rural Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, immigrant families, Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, knew something that their American neighbors had not yet learned. Dried mushrooms were not a luxury. They were a pantry staple that cost almost nothing and delivered flavor far beyond their price. A handful of dried mushrooms soaked in warm water for 30 minutes. Then the soaking water, dark brown, intensely savory, went into the pot along with the softened mushrooms, an onion, a potato diced small, and enough water to stretch it into a full meal. Simmered for 40 minutes, seasoned with salt and pepper, and served with a thick slice of rye bread for soaking. The umami depth of that soup was remarkable. It tasted expensive. It tasted like something you would order in a restaurant. It cost 9 cents and took 45 minutes from pantry to table. The immigrant grandmothers who made this every winter were not cooking poor. They were cooking smart, smarter than most of what replaced them. Number 12. Tomato rice soup. A can of crushed tomatoes cost 9 cents in 1934. A cup of white rice cost 3 cents. Water was free. You simmered the tomatoes with twice as much water, brought it to a boil, dropped in the rice, and let it cook until the rice swelled and thickened the broth into something almost creamy. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to balance the acid. The rice absorbed the tomato flavor from the inside out, so every grain tasted of the broth it had cooked in. Served hot in a wide bowl with bread crumbled in, this was Tuesday night supper for families from New England to Texas. It was the soup that crossed every regional and ethnic line because tomatoes and rice were available everywhere and cost almost nothing anywhere. Children who were sick ate this. Mothers ate it cold from the pot the next morning before anyone else woke up. It reheated perfectly. It tasted better on day 2. It never failed the people who needed it. Number 11. Ham bone vegetable soup. After the Easter ham or the Christmas ham had been eaten down to the bone, scraped, sliced, picked clean, the bone itself became the next 3 days of meals. A ham bone dropped into a pot with whatever vegetables were available. A potato or two, a carrot going soft, half an onion, a stalk of celery. Covered with water and simmered for 3 hours until the broth turned the color of weak tea and the bone had given up every trace of smoky, salted flavor it had ever held. The meat that fell from the bone, small shreds, almost stringy, distributed itself through the soup. This was a soup built on the principle that nothing paid for with money should be wasted before it had given everything it possibly could. The ham had been eaten. The bone still had 3 meals left in it. Depression households understood this arithmetic the way a mathematician understands an equation, not as philosophy, but as simple fact. Number 10, navy bean and onion soup. No ham bone required. That was the genius of navy bean and onion soup. The simplest, most reliable, most filling soup in the Depression pantry required nothing you did not already have. A cup of dried navy beans soaked overnight, then simmered for 2 hours with 2 onions, water, salt, and a bay leaf. The beans burst open slowly as they cooked, releasing starch that thickened the broth into something white and cloudy and dense. The onions dissolved into sweetness, and the bay leaf gave the whole pot a depth it had no business having, given what it cost. A pound of dried navy beans cost 9 cents in 1935. This single pound, cooked in this simple way, produced enough soup to feed a family of 4 for 2 full days. That is 18 cents of ingredients feeding 6 meals. The United States Senate has served navy bean soup in its cafeteria every single day since 1907. Not because senators are nostalgic, because it works. Because it has always worked. The families who ate it during the Depression were eating the same soup that lawmakers ate in Washington, and probably making it better. There is a reason these soups have been forgotten. And it is not because they were bad. It is because a bad soup costs nothing to make and a good canned soup costs 60 cents. The food industry understood, very quickly, that teaching families to distrust their own kitchens was worth billions of dollars. They hired home economists. They placed advertisements in women's magazines. They created fictional characters, cheerful, well-dressed women who stood in clean, modern kitchens and opened cans and called it cooking. The message underneath every advertisement was the same. What your grandmother made was poverty. What we are selling is progress. The families who grew up on navy bean soup and potato peel broth were not eating poverty. They were eating knowledge, accumulated, tested, refined over generations, that no corporation can put in a can and no advertisement can replace. The soups on this list are not forgotten because they failed. They are forgotten because someone made money from the forgetting. Number 9, lentil and carrot soup. Lentils do not need soaking. That was the practical genius that made them the Depression cook's most reliable ingredient. 30 minutes from dry to done, no planning required, no overnight preparation necessary. A cup of red or green lentils, 2 carrots, 1 onion, water, salt, and a pinch of cumin or dried thyme. Everything into one pot. 30 minutes at a simmer, and the lentils dissolved into a thick, earthy, porridge-like soup that stuck to the ribs and kept you full for hours in a way that thin broths never could. A 1-pound bag of lentils cost 7 cents in 1933 and produced enough soup to feed a family of 5 for 2 days. Nutritionists now call lentils a superfood, high in protein, iron, fiber, and folate. The Depression mothers who fed their children lentil soup 3 times a week did not know any of that. Their children simply did not get sick as often as the neighbors' children. Number 8, milk and bread soup. In Scandinavian immigrant communities across Minnesota and the Dakotas, this soup was breakfast, supper, and sick day comfort all at once. Day-old bread torn into rough chunks, dropped into a pot of warm milk, seasoned with salt and a pinch of sugar. Heated gently until the bread swelled and softened and the whole thing thickened into something between a soup and a porridge. A drizzle of butter if available. Nothing else needed. A quart of milk cost 21 cents in 1932. Combined with bread already going stale, this meal cost almost nothing and was ready in 5 minutes. Children ate it without complaint because warm milk and soft bread is one of the most fundamentally comforting things a human being can eat. It required no skill. It required no recipe. It required only a pot and the willingness to use what was already there. In a Depression household, that willingness was everything. Number 7, split pea soup. A bag of split peas, a leftover ham bone if you had one, plain water if you did not, an onion, a carrot, salt, and thyme. 2 hours at a low simmer and the peas dissolved completely into a thick, pale green soup, so dense a spoon stood upright in it. The ham bone gave it smokiness, the onion gave it sweetness, and the peas, those humble, unglamorous, utterly reliable dried peas, did the rest entirely on their own. A 1-pound bag of split peas cost 8 cents in 1934 and produced enough soup to feed a family of 4 for 3 days. Unlike other dried legumes, split peas needed no soaking. They could be started in the morning and forgotten until supper. For a mother managing a household, 3 jobs, and 4 children on a Depression income, a soup that cooked itself was not a convenience. It was survival. Hospitals served it, schools served it, the military served it. Every institution that needed to feed large numbers of people cheaply discovered, split pea soup independently and reached the same conclusion. Nothing feeds more people better for less money. Number 6, potato and onion soup. This is the soup the woman in Ohio made for 11 cents. This is the one. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, a spoonful of bacon grease, water, salt. You sliced the potatoes thin and diced the onion fine, dropped everything into a pot, and let it simmer until the potatoes broke apart and thickened the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. The bacon grease gave it depth, a whisper of smokiness that made the whole pot taste richer than it had any right to be. It cost 11 cents to make in 1932. It fed 4 people. It required no equipment beyond a knife and a pot. It could be made sitting on a kitchen stool with arthritic hands. And it tasted genuinely like something a careful cook had worked hard to produce. The doctor who told that Ohio woman she had the bone density of a younger woman never connected it to the potatoes. Potatoes, eaten with their minerals intact in a simple broth, deliver potassium and vitamin C in forms the body absorbs efficiently. She did not know that. She just made what she could afford, and her body, quietly, thanked her for it. Number 5, chicken foot broth. The butcher gave them away. That is how cheap chicken feet were in the 1930s. So cheap that butchers in city markets would drop a bag in with your order for nothing, or sell them for a penny a pound. What those feet produced when simmered for 4 hours was extraordinary. The collagen in the skin and joints dissolved into the water, turning the broth thick and golden and so deeply flavorful that it tasted like a stock made with 10 times the ingredients. Strained into a clean pot, seasoned with salt and pepper, ladled over rice or noodles or a thick slice of bread. Immigrant grandmothers across New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia knew this broth. Italian grandmothers, Jewish grandmothers, Chinese grandmothers. Every culture that understood poverty understood chicken feet. The American-born generation grew up and felt ashamed of them. They threw away the feet and bought canned broth that tasted like nothing and cost 15 times as much. Modern nutritionists now sell collagen supplements for $30 a jar and describe exactly what chicken foot broth delivers for free. Your great-grandmother was not poor in knowledge. She was rich in it. The poverty was elsewhere. Number 4, dried corn. Soup. Before canned corn and before frozen corn, there was dried corn, field corn harvested at the end of summer, dried on the cob and stripped into kernels that kept all winter in a cloth sack in the root cellar. A cup of dried corn soaked overnight, then simmered for 2 hours with water, an onion, and a piece of salt pork until the kernels softened and released their starch into the broth. The result was a thick, slightly sweet, deeply savory soup that tasted of the summer it had been harvested in. Native American cooking had been built on this technique for centuries. Depression-era families in rural Indiana and Ohio rediscovered it because they had no choice. A pound of dried corn cost 4 cents. The salt pork added another 6. For 10 cents, a pot appeared on the table that fed a family for 2 days and tasted like a meal made from abundance rather than the scraps of a failing economy. Say this plainly. The families who ate these soups were not less than the families who did not. The Depression did not divide people into those who suffered and those who cooked well. It divided people into those who had knowledge and those who did not. And the ones with knowledge ate better, stayed healthier, and fed their children more completely on less money than anyone had a right to expect. Every soup on this list is an act of intelligence. Potato peel broth is not failure. It is the correct response to a situation where every calorie, every cent, and every nutritional compound in the kitchen has to be accounted for. The women who made these soups were not cooking desperately. They were cooking precisely. We should remember that. We should say it out loud, and we should make the soup. Number 3, Hoover stew. Soup. Named, without affection, for the president most Americans blame for the Depression. Hoover stew had many versions, but the soup version, which appeared in relief kitchens across New York and Chicago, was the one that fed thousands in the worst years. A pot of water, a can of whole tomatoes crushed in by hand, a handful of elbow macaroni, sliced hot dogs or dried sausage if available, a diced onion, salt, pepper. Everything into one pot. 20 minutes at a boil, and the macaroni swelled in the tomato broth. The sausage gave up its fat to the soup, and the onion dissolved into sweetness. It was filling in the way that only starch can be. It was warm. It was hot. And in a bread line in January 1932, hot and filling were the only 2 qualities that mattered. The name was not meant kindly, but the soup itself was. The people who made it in those relief kitchens, volunteers, mostly women, working 12-hour days to feed strangers, made it with everything they had. A pot of Hoover stew in 1932 was not politics. It was grace. Number 2, bone marrow soup. When the roast was gone and the pot roast had been eaten and the soup had been made from the leftover broth, the bones themselves still had something left to give. Cracked open with a heavy knife, the marrow inside the femur bones of beef or pork was scooped out, dropped into a pot of water with salt and an onion, and simmered for 2 hours until the fat rendered completely into the broth, and the water turned ivory-colored and almost silky, strained and served plain, or over rice, or with bread to soak up every drop. Bone marrow soup fed families who had literally nothing else. The bones came from the butcher for pennies, sometimes for free because no one else was buying them, and what they produced was a broth so dense with fat and collagen and minerals that it was genuinely restorative. People who had been sick ate it and recovered faster. People who had been cold ate it and warmed from the inside. High-end restaurants now serve roasted bone marrow as an appetizer for $16. The Depression grandmothers who made this soup from cracked bones and boiling water invented the dish 40 years before any chef put it on a menu. They just did not get the credit. Number 1, bean soup. Not one specific bean, not one specific region, not one specific recipe. Just dried beans, whatever kind was in the pantry, covered with water, simmered with an onion, a bay leaf, and whatever scrap of cured pork was available, cooked low and slow until the beans burst open and the broth thickened into something that could sustain human life through a hard winter on almost nothing. This is the soup that appears in every oral history of the Depression. In Appalachian coal camps, in Oklahoma Dust Bowl towns, in urban tenements in Chicago and Cleveland, in the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta, every region, every ethnicity, every family that lived through those years knows this soup, because this soup knew them. A pound of dried beans cost 8 cents in 1933. It fed 6 people for 2 days. Nothing in the American kitchen has ever done more for less, and nothing has been more completely erased by the convenience economy that replaced it. We traded this soup, this honest, nourishing, dignified soup, for canned broth and powdered mix and 60-second microwavable cups of something that tastes of almost nothing. The families who made bean soup did not have the choice to stop making it. They made it because they had to. They made it well. They fed their children. And those children grew up, got jobs, bought grocery stores full of canned goods, and forgot it existed. This is the soup we should remember most. The challenge. Make one of these this week, just one. The potato and onion soup, 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water, salt, is on the table in 30 minutes for less than $1. The navy bean and onion soup can go on in the morning and be ready by supper without you touching it again. The lentil and carrot soup takes 30 minutes and costs less than a cup of coffee. Make it. Sit down at the table. Set a place. Eat it slowly. These soups were never just about being cheap. They were about staying fed, staying human, and refusing to be beaten by circumstances that had nothing to do with your worth as a person. Drop in the comments which one you're going to make. I want to know if the bean soup gets the love it deserves, or if the potato and onion soup wins because of how simple it is. And if your grandmother made any of these, if you remember the smell of a soup pot on a winter stove in a kitchen that felt warm even when nothing outside it was, tell us. Tell us where you are from and what she called it. Because these were not just soups. They were proof that the people who had the least knew the most about how to keep going.